Hey, Alex. I've got a brilliant plan. Stop buying stuff from Britain.
Oh, why would I do that?
Because we're forming the most exclusive club in Europe, Cassid, the Continental System. No British goods allowed.
Oh, an economic club? Sounds fun. Do you serve vodka there?
No, only arrogance and embargoes. Sounds like a terrible club. Shh, count me out.
Hey guys, imagine marching halfway across Europe just to discover your enemy's best weapon is the weather. It's 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, Europe's self-proclaimed genius of war, decides to invade Russia. Why? Because the Tsar refused to play nice with his economic club called the Continental System, basically a no British shopping policy. Napoleon thought that he could teach the Russians some manners and be home by Christmas. Instead, he walked straight into a frozen nightmare. So if you want to support this madness and keep the stories coming, just like and subscribe. And if you leave a comment, that's my happiness quota for the day. Ready? Let's roll back the clock and watch humanity do what it does best. Absolutely lose its mind. It all started with ego, trade, and a map that looked way smaller than it really was. Napoleon, sitting in Paris with his tiny hat and enormous confidence, decided to gather an army of about 600,000 men from all over Europe. This was the so-called Grande Armée. French Poles, Italians, Germans, even a few confused Dutchmen who thought they were signing up for a sightseeing tour. It was the largest invasion force the world had ever seen, and their target was the vast freezing mystery known as Russia. Now, Napoleon wasn't stupid. Arrogant, yes. Suicidally overconfident, also yes. But not stupid. He knew logistics were everything. His plan was simple. Crush the Russian army quickly, capture Moscow, force the Tsar to surrender, and declare victory before winter. Because, say it with me, you never fight a Russian winter, except he did. By June 1812, the Grande Armée began its march across the Niemen River. At first, it looked glorious. Thousands of drums beating, eagles flying, banners shining under the summer sun. But a few weeks in, the men realized two things. One, Russia is much bigger than France thought, and two, Russian soldiers kept running away. Not because they were cowards, but because of a strategy so crazy it worked. The scorched earth. The Russians burned everything, villages, crops, even wells, before retreating. It was like chasing someone who keeps throwing your dinner into the fire. Napoleon's men were starving before they even reached Moscow. Horses died by the thousands. Soldiers began eating whatever they could find. Rats, bark, maybe even the occasional pair of boots. The French medical corps politely called it foraging. Everyone else called it panic dining. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander I sat back like a chess player watching his opponent take all the wrong moves. His generals, Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, knew better than to fight Napoleon head on. Let him march, they said. He'll run out of food before he runs out of arrogance. Kutuzov was old, one-eyed, and deeply Russian in the sense that he could probably survive a blizzard by glaring at it. His patience was terrifying. The only major battle before Moscow was Borodino. Fought on September 7th, 1812, it was brutal. Over 70,000 casualties in a single day. Imagine the world's deadliest draw. Napoleon technically won because the Russians retreated, but at the cost of an army so exhausted it could barely stand. Historians still argue whether Borodino was a victory or just an elaborate act of collective exhaustion. One French officer wrote, "The ground was carpeted with the dead." Another simply wrote, "This is hell but colder." And yet Napoleon pushed on, convinced that Moscow would be the key. After all, if you take the enemy's capital, they must surrender, right? Logical. Except Russia is allergic to logic. When the French finally entered Moscow, expecting surrender and champagne, they found nothing. The city was abandoned. Then that night, fires broke out everywhere. Wooden houses, warehouses, even the Kremlin. It all burned. Who started it? To this day, no one knows for sure. Maybe the Russians torched it themselves, maybe accidental chaos. But Napoleon, standing in the middle of a burning ghost city, realized something horrifying. There was no victory to claim. He waited 1 week. 2 weeks, then a month. No Tsar, no peace envoy, just smoke, hunger, and the faint sound of someone freezing in the next street. The French soldiers began looting whatever was left, mostly vodka. Morale improved briefly, then plummeted when they realized vodka isn't food. By October, Napoleon finally admitted the obvious. We are not staying here for the winter. His advisors probably applauded that one. The retreat began, a decision that would turn a bad idea into a historical tragedy. But that's for the next part of our story. As the Grande Armée packed up to leave Moscow in October 1812, Napoleon tried to pretend everything was under control. You know that guy at a party who insists he's not lost on the way home, even while standing in a swamp? That was Napoleon. His army was sick, starving, and about to march straight into winter. But he still ordered, "We will retreat in good order," which in hindsight is like saying, "We'll land softly after hitting a mountain." The French left Moscow carrying wagons full of loot, paintings, silver, furniture, even church bells. One general supposedly brought along a bathtub. A bathtub in the middle of the Russian steppe. But the real problem wasn't greed, it was the snow. The first flakes fell in late October, and within weeks, temperatures dropped below 20 degrees. Horses froze mid-step, cannons couldn't roll, muskets jammed, soldiers wrapped themselves in carpets, curtains, even dead animals. The Grande Armée was turning into the world's saddest fashion show, and the Russians? Oh, they weren't done yet. Cossacks began circling the retreating army like wolves. These were cavalrymen from the southern steppes. Fur hats, long lances, and a sense of humor as cold as the wind. They'd appear from nowhere, hit the rear guards, and vanish again. To the French, it was like being haunted by horsemen. One survivor wrote, "We no longer marched, we fled." Still, Napoleon pressed on, his destination, Smolensk, where he hoped to regroup and find supplies. But by the time they arrived, Smolensk was stripped bare. Remember the scorched earth tactic? The Russians had applied it again. If food existed, it was already on fire. Napoleon began to lose his grip, not just on his empire, but on reality. Reports from the time describe him pacing in silence, muttering calculations. How many men left? How many cannons? Could he reach the Berezina River before the Russians cut him off? It was a grim math problem, and every answer was no. The retreat turned apocalyptic. Frostbite turned fingers black, and soldiers broke open frozen corpses just to take their coats. When horses died, men boiled the meat in their helmets. When helmets froze, they gnawed the leather straps. Out of 600,000 who had crossed into Russia, maybe 100,000 were still alive by this point, and half of them could barely walk. Let's pause here for a strange but true detail. Napoleon actually brought along an opera singer. Yes, an opera singer. Her name was Giuseppina Grassini, and rumor has it she sang to lift the emperor's spirits. Imagine belting out Italian arias while everyone else eats their gloves. The absurdity of empire, ladies and gentlemen. Then came the most infamous moment of all, the crossing of the Berezina River in late November. The French needed to cross to escape a Russian trap. Problem? The bridge had been destroyed, so the engineers, frozen to the bone, built 2 new ones out of whatever wood they could find. Thousands of men, horses, and wagons crowded to cross. Russian artillery opened fire. Chaos erupted. The bridges collapsed under the weight, hurling men into the icy water. Those who fell were instantly encased in ice. A French officer later wrote, "The river was full of floating corpses, frozen together in clusters like wreaths." Historians still argue how many died at Berezina. Some say 20,000, others twice that. Either way, it was less a retreat and more a slow-motion disaster set to the soundtrack of human misery. But somehow Napoleon survived. He crossed the river and looked back at what remained of his army. Gaunt, limping ghosts trudging west. It was no longer an army, just a legend collapsing in real time. For the first time, Napoleon faced something he couldn't outthink: nature itself. In December, with the situation hopeless, Napoleon did something remarkable. He abandoned his troops, left them in the snow, and raced back to Paris in a sleigh. He claimed it was for urgent political reasons, which in French translates roughly to "I'm getting out before this gets worse." His men didn't see him again. Back in Paris, the government announced he was safe, spinning it as a strategic withdrawal, which is technically true if running for your life counts as strategy. The once mighty Grande Armée was now reduced to a few thousand survivors staggering into Poland, their uniforms in rags, their faces hollow. A Russian observer said, "They entered as masters and left as beggars." And yet, incredibly, the myth of Napoleon survived too. Newspapers still called him invincible. Artists painted him standing heroically against a snowstorm, as if the weather itself were his only enemy. The truth, though, was simpler. He had gambled on glory and lost to geography. Still, one can't help but admire the scale of the failure. It wasn't just a defeat. It was an entire civilization's ego freezing solid in the Russian tundra. And as for the soldiers who made it home, they carried frostbite, trauma, and stories no one believed. "We saw hell," one survivor said, "and it was white. But our story's not over yet, because if there's one thing history loves, it's watching great men pretend nothing happened." When Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1812, he did what any good politician does after setting half of Europe on fire. He blamed the weather. Standing before his council, he spun a tale of unforeseen meteorological conditions, as if a Russian winter were some rare cosmic event no one could have predicted. France applauded anyway. After all, who was going to tell the emperor he just lost the greatest army ever assembled to frostbite and bad planning? But outside the glitter of Parisian salons, reality was thawing into chaos. The Grande Armée was gone. 500,000 men vanished into snow and silence. Families waited for sons who would never return. The empire that had once stretched from Spain to Poland was starting to wobble like an overworked souffle. Prussia, Austria, even his allies began to quietly step back, pretending they'd always thought the invasion was a bad idea. Napoleon, though, refused to slow down. Within weeks of returning, he was already building another army. Because when you're Napoleon, retreat is just a pause between victories. France scraped together another 300,000 young recruits, boys really, barely trained and marching off to fight again. The veterans who survived Russia looked at them and muttered, "They have no idea." Meanwhile, in Russia, the mood was complicated. The Tsar celebrated victory, but the country was devastated. Entire towns were gone. Millions were displaced. Moscow itself was a burnt skeleton, and yet Russia's sense of pride grew stronger than ever. For the first time, they had repelled the greatest general in Europe. It was the birth of a national myth, the idea that no invader, no matter how clever or fashionable, could conquer Mother Russia. It's a lesson that, historically speaking, several future dictators would also ignore. Back in France, Napoleon's propaganda machine got to work. Paintings showed him gazing nobly into blizzards, his hand tucked in his coat like he was contemplating philosophy, not frostbite. The retreat was described not as a catastrophe, but as a heroic endurance test. One newspaper headline read, "The Emperor returns unshaken," which technically was true. He was unshaken because he'd been inside a heated carriage the entire time. Still, Napoleon's luck was running out. The disaster in Russia inspired a new coalition of enemies. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, all ready to take him down. In 1813, they met him again in Germany, at Leipzig, in what historians now call the Battle of the Nations. It was the biggest fight Europe had ever seen. Napoleon fought bravely, but without his veteran army, it was like watching a chess grandmaster forced to play checkers with missing pieces. The Allies crushed him, and here's a curious twist. Even after losing, Napoleon refused to quit. When his marshals begged him to surrender, he supposedly snapped, "A man like me doesn't give up. I'll be back in Paris before you finish talking." Spoiler, he wasn't. By 1814, the coalition marched into France. Paris fell, Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba, essentially Europe's version of a timeout chair. But because history loves drama, he escaped. Less than a year later, in 1815, he sailed back to France, landed on the coast, and started marching toward Paris again. Soldiers sent to stop him switched sides as soon as they saw him. "The Emperor has returned," they cried. It was the greatest comeback tour in history, until it wasn't. 3 months later came Waterloo, where Napoleon's final act unfolded, and though that's a story for another day, the shadow of 1812 still hung over him. Many historians agree the Russian campaign broke something fundamental in him. The man who had once commanded Europe with surgical precision now relied on luck and legend, and both had frozen to death outside Moscow. Let's take a moment to reflect on what the invasion achieved. Politically, nothing. Militarily, ruin. Economically, disaster. But symbolically, everything. It became a warning carved into European memory about pride, ambition, and the limits of human stubbornness. The Russian winter didn't just defeat Napoleon, it humbled an entire continent. And yet, even after all that, there's something weirdly admirable about the sheer absurdity of it all. 600,000 men marching into a country so vast it eats armies for breakfast. One emperor thinking he could outsmart geography. It's tragic, yes, but also magnificently, cosmically foolish. The kind of story that makes you laugh first and then sigh later. Today, historians still debate the finer points. Did Napoleon underestimate Russia or overestimate himself? Was the invasion doomed from the start, or could it have succeeded with better timing? Was the burning of Moscow deliberate or accidental? We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that 1812 became shorthand for a thing even geniuses can't control: hubris. And perhaps that's why the story still matters, because every empire, every great power, every confident leader eventually finds their own Russia, the moment when ambition meets the limits of reality. Sometimes that limit is a frozen river. Sometimes it's just a very bad idea dressed in gold braid. As for Napoleon, his empire melted away, but his legend didn't. He remains both hero and fool, visionary and egomaniac, a man who conquered half the world only to be defeated by snowflakes. And maybe that's the truest punchline in all of history, that no matter how brilliant we think we are, nature and time always get the last laugh. So next time someone tells you they have an unbeatable plan, just smile and say, sure, Napoleon thought so too. Thanks for listening, and remember, history's not just about battles and dates. It's about watching humanity do the same ridiculous things over and over with slightly better uniforms. See you in the next war.